Dennis and Andy, as you've recruited people for C-level roles in your portfolio companies, how have you used assessment, and are there any particular strategies or approaches that you've found most useful?
When we're looking at C-level talent in portfolio companies, it can either be an existing portfolio company or something that you're kind of working through in the diligence process. So I kind of look at it on this continuum of different ways you can interact with those candidates. One is just the straight interview process where you're not using assessment, which I ultimately wouldn't recommend in situations where you're looking for C-level talent. You can have the assessment with just a traditional interviewing process. And then third is what we consider the assessment with a very intensive interview process for the C-level talent. So we look at it as a big part of that equation to give you facts and data, because the hiring process from our perspective is a combination of both art and science. The assessment gives you a lot of great science, gives you some excellent data as far as understanding not only how that person is going to interact specifically to that job that they're tasked with, but if you're doing the assessment on multiple people, you can get a really good sense of where the talent collectively comes together as a whole. I think it was similar to what Jeff flashed on that screen. And then ultimately, where are there going to be gaps for executing your value creation plan? So that to us is a really critical component in that overall assessment of saying, okay, can this person mesh culturally? Can they drive the business to the scale that we're going to need? The assessment gives you the foundation by which you can develop a lot of the other characteristics that go hand in hand with understanding the gaps and the talent needs.
When I start working with an organization, either in due diligence or shortly thereafter, we've identified, in the deal underwriting, some value creation drivers. What are we going to do to help the business create value? And oftentimes that is going to require bringing additional people into the business. Then you get into a conversation about how do you add rigor to the process. So I work mostly with middle market companies. Often in some of my companies, they will do like one interview. The CEO will meet with somebody, and in many of those cases, I've actually observed the interviews where the CEO does most of the talking in the interview. Okay, so it's not a particularly inquisitive process. And so I go in and say, okay, how do we raise the bar here and try to make sure that we're bringing in the level of talent with the different capabilities we need, because obviously to get where we want to go over 5 years is different than where we are. And so I start talking about assessments with them, and my basic approach is to try and bring the scientific method to selecting employees. Okay, so it's a multiple hurdle hypothesis testing approach. So you'll start out and say, these are the things I need in a role. Here are the key capabilities. And then you'll do your first round interviews and you'll say, how did the person kind of match up? And you think, well, pretty good, but I have these concerns. So those form the hypothesis for the next round, right? And then they'll come to assessment at some point. And in the pre-call, we'll talk about both what's necessary in the role, but also, what are the gaps we're concerned about? And we'll measure the person's gaps or perceived gaps from the first round interviews against what we get from the assessments. And even after assessment, because it's rare that you get somebody who's like great on every dimension in an assessment, then the reference checks are done. And again, it's a hypothesis test. Well, the assessment showed they're weak in, competency A and competency D. Let's really probe in those in the reference checks. And so that's the approach that I try to bring to portfolio companies. One of the things that has really helped is if you can get the CEO themselves to go through an assessment, it really helps them understand the output. So their buy-in is there. I think there's a little bit of trepidation on the part of, PE CEOs that someone may make them do this and want to know my secrets, right? So my preference is, I'll let you know your own secrets and we won't share them with anybody. But what they do get out of it is, they kind of nailed me. They knew exactly like what my strengths and weaknesses were. And then they believe the output a lot more when they see it from somebody else. The other thing that I think I've tried to do is be consistent about the assessment approach. It's like any other cultural thing. If you can get an organization to adopt and to really understand the tool, they're going to be more effective with it. So I would urge you as a PE firm to pick a methodology and stick with it, and use it across portfolio companies, but because you'll get a lot smarter about how to use the assessments if you see it more often than not. So if you think about who you use to do your Q of E in your portfolio, quality of earnings reports, right? You're probably using the same firms and the same law firms for a lot of your deals. And you develop the ability to communicate and ask questions that you wouldn't if you're doing RFPs every time you went into a deal and you're picking someone different to do your work. I would suggest you use assessment the same way, which is develop a capability and build on it internally and within your portfolio companies by having a consistent approach.
It's clear from both of you that interviews are pretty standard. I mean, that's been used for a long time. It's not as though people have ignored the importance of leadership in doing their due diligence. But are there particular tools or approaches or techniques in the assessment process that you find valuable, that you want to make sure are part of every time you're engaged in this process?
I subscribe to the approach that MDA takes, which is multiple instruments and multiple raters. So there are, as we all know, there are other techniques, and I think, Jeff, you mentioned Myers-Briggs. I'll go into some organizations and I'll think, they have a single kind of bullet approach. And that's on the one scale. And on the other, in the private equity environment in particular, there are a couple of consulting firms that do very deep dive interviews. They do their very extensive kind of 4 or 5 hour interviews, but typically they don't do role plays. They don't have a work sample in it. They don't do the personality testing. They don't do the cognitive skills testing. And I guess maybe it's my corporate background where doing these types of assessments, they're not new. Okay, I started working with these late 80s or early 90s in my pre-Capital One era, okay, where the research showed that multiple instrument, multiple rating techniques are more effective than any single rating. The other thing I will say, kind of comparing this approach to, the deep dive interview approach is, the deep dive interview approach typically relies on a scorecard approach. And they say, what are the 4 or 5 things you really need in the person in this job? And what we get on our approach is a more comprehensive readout on more dimensions, okay, more competencies. And in my experience, you can have it's usually not the thing that you're looking for that causes someone to derail, okay? So we'll get people and we'll say, these are the 5 things that really matter, but they're weak on this competency here. And where you say, but that's not important, it usually becomes important, okay? So I find the multiple instrument, full kind of range of competencies approach to give me more information and allow me to think about things I maybe hadn't thought about in the context of the role. Whereas, and I'll give you an example, one of my companies, we used a different assessment at the request of the PE firm. And I saw the readout, the report, and I said, really interesting report, but I'm not sure the assumption is correct. There's an assumption here based on what they had gotten in a pre-call that said they didn't want someone who would disrupt the team. And I said, what I've learned about the team is you need culture change. And to achieve culture change, it's more likely than not you're going to need to change players below the CEO. You actually want a CEO who is willing to break a few dishes along the way. And the managing director of the PE firm called the person that did the assessment and said, what if we change this assumption? And they said, well, I would change my recommendation from not hire to then go ahead and hire. And the person's been fabulous in the role. And yes, he's made changes to some of the team. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is just the process that we've undertaken is usually one of involving the board or the investor, involving the management team, especially if it's somebody that's coming into a current situation where you already hold or have a portfolio company in the space. We will make strategy part of that, especially if it's at a C level. If it's a CEO or COO, what we'll do is we'll do a interview initially with a smaller group of people. We'll have that individual go and spend time visiting facilities, spending time with the management team, whatever it is, and then come back to us with, here's my observations, here's what I'm thinking about. And you learn a lot from where they drill in, and then most importantly, who they want to spend time with and what they want to do with some of their follow-ups to make sure that the situation is good for them as well. So we make it a much more holistic approach from that perspective. And we're also assessing a lot of the soft skills along the way. So can they fit into the culture? How do they interact when they're at a facility? Does that seem like something that's going to jive with, how that leadership team has operated historically? You pick up a lot of those nuances by making it kind of a real life play where you're in the field versus just going through the interview process. And that takes time. All this stuff takes a lot of time, but I think it's very effective, especially when you combine it with the assessments. One other thing I was just thinking about as we were talking about it here, that transition is especially important from my perspective, and seeing this multiple times, where you have somebody that's going from a large corporation into a middle market private equity situation or a smaller private equity situation, whatever it is. I think that is something that is learned the hard way oftentimes. I'm batting 1,000% on talking to executives that say, oh yeah, I would love to go from General Mills to this small business, but they don't know what that really means and what that's like day to day, where you've got to roll up your sleeves and you don't have a team of hundreds and thousands of people to support you in your role. And that only comes out from really assessing their work product, assessing how they would think about running that operation. I think that's where digging into some of the data on where they would be strong and weak, and the ability to actually execute at that level in the past is really important.
I want to just underscore a couple of points that Dennis made in terms of like having the CEO go through the process themselves. I do think really helps them to understand what it is and maybe what it isn't. I think sometimes they hear they're going to meet with a psychologist and they think, they're going to be on a couch and talking about their childhood and that sort of thing. And in the case of the merger where we had the two teams coming together, it was interesting. The CEO said, wow, what you're telling me about my team is right on, which makes me feel better about what you're telling me about this other team that I don't know. So it just helped to, it validated kind of his thoughts about his own team and then about the other team. The other thing is using some type of work sample or the simulations in our case, because when you've got leaders at this level, at this point in their career, they've developed, skills along the way. And so an interview or even just the personality assessments doesn't always tell the whole story, because they may have grown and developed new skills. And so I think the simulations allow you to see kind of what they've developed that may not necessarily be clear from just the interview or personality data. It also it makes it harder for them to just excuse away something that you might see in the personality data, because you said, but we kind of saw it in action. It's harder to just discount it when you have that kind of real life behavior.
Yeah, and there's a clear connection between the simulations you're talking about and the work sample that Andy created. So it's an opportunity to see the skills in action.
Need help achieving high performance leadership? Let's begin a conversation.